Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. I'm sure you've heard the saying, penny wise, pound foolish. And if you haven't, it's basically a phrase that's all about when we spend small amounts of money on something, or we try to be cheap. And even though we think we've saved money, it's actually cost us more money in the long term. So it's a short-term saving, but a disproportionate long-term cost. And that's what we mean when we say penny wise, pound foolish. Now, I thought I'd actually take this phrase and apply it to different levels of human organization, starting from individuals all the way up to governments. So at an individual level, I think everyone is guilty of this. I know I am, but we pick a good or a service that we know is cheap, that might be a bit too good to be true, and as a result, it costs us a lot more. I think in the most extreme cases, when you hear about people who get scammed, generally the reason somebody falls into a scam is something was simply too good to be true and it looked like a great short-term saving, but it cost them a lot more money down the track. Now, a personal expense I've done this with was flights. Now, last year I visited Sri Lanka during its toughest economic crisis, and I knew that going on Sri Lankan Airlines, the national carrier, probably wasn't the best idea, but it was the cheapest ticket. Now, I could have chosen to flown Singapore Airlines for about $600 to $700 more, but I chose not to. And as a result, I got delayed on my way to Sri Lanka by about 4 hours or so, 4 to 5 hours. But on my way back, I got delayed for over 24 hours. So I was stuck at Melbourne Airport overnight. So there were just delays throughout my flight, both in Sri Lanka and when I got to Australia. So I lost an entire day to waiting at airports that I didn't expect to spend. Now, that's an example of where I was penny wise. I saved some money in the short term, but was the impact on my sleep, my health, my sanity, was it worth that $600 to $700 difference? Absolutely not. And there's many examples of where individuals are penny wise, pound foolish. It could be down to food choices or decisions they like to make. Could also be things they put off. For example, not paying for education and training today might be a cheap decision. But if you are now uncompetitive in a future economy where those skills are highly coveted, and your current skills are not, then you have been pound foolish because you've missed out on a huge future opportunity. Now, going to a different grouping of humans, let's look at families. And you also see this happening in families. And I think the biggest one, and partially, it's also kind of reflecting on my own families, my friends' families, and people I've seen growing up, you do see the whole concept of penny wise, pound foolish in the family structure. And I think the most common one is actually not when a penny is saved, but when a penny is earned. And during childhood, parents will prioritize earning money because they feel this big pressure to give their children material things. So they will forego hours spent with their children to earn money. And if both parents are doing this and they're both working full-time jobs, in the short term, today, it seems like a great deal because there's money coming in. You can have maybe a nicer house. You can do a holiday with your kids every now and then. But if for majority of the year, you don't get to spend a lot of great quality time with your family because both parents are working, sometimes down the track, and this could be 10 or 20 years down the track, right? There could be negative consequences. Maybe you don't have such a great relationship with your kids. Maybe your kids have substance abuse, mental health issues. There's all sorts of things which manifest. And I think when I look at my generation, a lot of the issues that people have, and I'm talking about people who are in their 20s and 30s, could have been alleviated further down the track. The only difference when we look at family structures is, as an individual, when I decided to cheap out on my flight to Sri Lanka, I paid the price for that very immediately. So as soon as I boarded my flight and experienced delays and all sorts of issues, I felt the pain. But in family structure, I think it's one of these unique circumstances when you see people raising children that what you do today, the negative consequences don't really appear for decades. And it only smacks people in the face 20 years later. And I think that's kind of where you need to be super careful because you're navigating this ship and you can only steer it extremely slowly, and you don't want to be the Titanic. And pardon the reference, I do know current events at the moment, but you don't want to hit an iceberg when it comes to your family. So I've always thought about, if I were going to raise kids in the future, maybe I would choose to forego income so I could have a better relationship in the future with those children. But that is an example, I think, some examples of where the whole penny wise pound foolish concept kicks into the way that families are run. The next structure of humans we want to look at, which a lot of people, especially those of you listening to this, are part of, are companies. Now, we do see penny wise pound foolishness in companies, and there is good reason for this. And I think the first reason is inherently as humans, and in all of the previous examples I've mentioned, we are incentivized to look at the short term up until maybe the last, 10, 20,000 years, I guess, before the advent of modern agriculture. We lived in a world where short-term wins are the way you survive day to day. For you to survive, you now need to go hunt some animal, and that's a very short-term decision. You kill it and you eat it today, right? And you need to eat it today because the meat's going to go off. But once humans invented agriculture and we were able to store value, even beginning as early as storing things like grain, when we were able to put things away, all of a sudden, society has been designed to benefit people who inherently prioritize the long term. But that doesn't mean that we as humans, we really still haven't evolved to do that. We are still creatures who love the short term. I know this because every time I see a piece of sugar or something sugary or something sweet in the supermarket or in my pantry, I will inherently go for it, even though I know it's not the best thing for me. And companies are no different. And there are reasons for this. There might be bonus cycles or performance cycles. And as a result, people are trying to hit KPIs. Maybe somebody is trying to sell a business and they have a 3 to 5 year horizon. And as a result, a lot of short-term decision making kicks in. And it comes to a point where is a short-term win, is saving money in the short term, while it might look good on the balance sheet, how does that affect the long-term potential of the business? And really, it's not the one is right and the other is wrong, but it's about maximizing those. And you always hear stories, and I've heard stories from friends where they've all realized that, that they've been drastically underpaid at their job and maybe they're a top performer. And they realize that they're getting paid significantly less than everyone else. And as a result of that, they leave the company and they take a lot of institutional knowledge with them. They also create a situation where they've raised a flag in the company that, hey, this person who is performing has left. What is going to happen? Should we start thinking about it? And attrition, especially of high-performing employees, is not something that companies want. But in the short term, I'm sure that somebody who was looking at the company balance sheets was thinking, wow, these are such great value employees. We're getting such a great deal. Right? We're being penny wise. Unfortunately, it can also be pound foolish. Now, the next structure of human organization I want to look at and talk about with this phrase is government. So where can governments be penny wise, pound foolish? Now, we actually see this all the time, and the reason for this is we were just talking about how humans are inherently geared for the short term. And if you look at Western democracies, what are our election cycles? Typically, we're talking 3 to 8 year election cycles, depending on the levels of government you're looking at. I know that there are certain types of government and legislative bodies where you can have longer term, 6 to 8 years. But in Australia, when we elect the current federal government and prime ministers, the ones who sit in the lower house, they're on a 3-year term. So naturally, there's a lot of short-term thinking. And let's talk about the economy at the moment, right? There are a lot of global challenges, and a lot of governments in the West are struggling to increase GDP per capita. Right? So we've already gone into a GDP per capita recession, but it is in the government's interest to fudge the economic numbers. So if you can't fix GDP per capita, which would be great, then the next best thing is just make GDP go up. And there's so many ways to do this. And one way is to kind of turn on the immigration tap to unsustainable levels. And in the short term, this looks great because we've increased demand in the economy, but this also contributes to inflation, which has other costs. And as we know, we're currently in a stage of the global economy, at least in Western democracies, where we have rampant inflation. And the government is deciding to take very cheap measures to increase gross domestic product by increasing demand for housing, for goods and services, by having more people come at a very precarious time. And I'm not saying that immigration isn't needed at all, but it's more a comment on the level of immigration. This is a short term, and I personally believe that in the short term, this is being very penny wise, but in the long term, pound foolish, because people will see through this, and there are significant costs for the measures that government is taking to increase GDP. And it's not just migration, it's things like the government in Australia, for example, is working against the Reserve Bank of Australia. So the Reserve Bank is increasing interest rates, they're making money harder to access, whilst the government is essentially pumping more money into the economy using a multitude of means. And then beyond the government, we have the entire world. And I think one issue where the world could be being penny wise, pound foolish is global warming. Now, this is one of those challenging things where developing economies still need access to cheap energy, and it is unfair for the West, who has benefited from coal and oil for over a century, to deny that same right to developing nations. However, more broadly, are we being penny wise, pound foolish? And is there a way to have some sort of equality in allowing developing countries to either use legacy fuels, but then to assist them to transition to more renewable sources of energy without disadvantaging their growth? Now, that is something that costs money, and no one's really doing that. So everyone's trying to save money in that debate. But in the long run, we know that if global climate gets out of control, and I know not everyone holds this view, so I will respect that, but if it does get out of control, how much more are we going to end up spending? Are we being penny wise, pound foolish as a human society? So I'm going to leave it there, but it is important to think about where in life we are being penny wise, pound foolish. And I don't think this just applies to where we're trying to save money. Sometimes you could be trying to make more money in a particular area, or you could be avoiding an opportunity and it seems to be the safer bet, but in the long run, it is going to cost you more. So we can broaden that definition of penny wise, pound foolish and try to work out more optimal outcomes for ourselves. So with that, I'll leave it there, and I'm wishing everyone who's listening to this great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.